Chapter 10. A Castle on the Brandywine. Christmas morning the boys awakened early and crept from beneath their warm bearskins in eager anticipation of gifts from Santa Claus. Of course, they had long before learned who Santa Claus was, but they loved the story, and in the wisdom of their innocence clung to an illusion which brought them happiness. The sun had risen upon a scene such as winter only can produce. Surely Aladdin had come to the Blue River upon the wings of the Christmas storm, had rubbed his lamp, and lo! the humble cabin was in the heart of a fairyland, such as was never conceived by the mind of a genie. Snow lay upon the ground like a soft carpet of white velvet 10 inches thick. The boughs of the trees were festooned with a foliage that spring cannot rival. Even the locust trees, which in their pride of blossom cry out in June time for our admiration, seemed to say, "See what we can do in winter?" And the sycamore and the beech dropped their branches as if to call attention to their winter flowers given by that rarest of artists, Jack Frost. The boys quickly donned their heavy buckskin clothing and moccasins and climbed down the pole to the room where their father and mother were sleeping. Jim awakened his parents with a cry of Christmas gift, but Balser's attention was attracted to a barrel standing by the fireplace, which his father had brought from Brookville, and into which the boys had not been permitted to look the night before. Balser had a shrewd suspicion of what the barrel contained, and his delight knew no bounds when he found, as he had hoped, that it was filled with steel traps of the size used to catch beavers, coons, and foxes. Since he had owned a gun, Balser's great desire had been to possess a number of traps. As I have already told you, the pelts of animals taken in winter are of great value, and our little hero longed to begin life on his own account as a hunter and trapper. I might tell you of the joyous Christmas morning in the humble cabin when the gifts which Mr. Brent had brought back from Brookville were distributed. I might tell you of the new gown for Mother, of the bright red mufflers, of the shoes for Sunday wear, and the store caps for the boys, to be used upon holiday occasions. I might tell you of the candies and nuts, and of the rarest of all the gifts, an orange for each member of the family, for that fruit had never before been seen upon Blue River. But I must take you to the castle on Brandywine. You may wonder how there came to be a castle in the wilderness on Brandywine. But I am sure when you learn about it, you will declare that it was fairer than any castle ever built of mortar and stone, and that the adventures which befell our little heroes were as glorious as ever fell to the lot of spurred and belted knight. Immediately after breakfast, when the chores had all been finished, Balser and Jim started down the river to visit Lenny and Tom. Balser carried with him 2 Christmas presents for his friends, a steel trap for Tom, and the orange which his father had brought him from Brookville for Lenny. I might also tell you of Tom's delight when he received the trap, and of Lenny's smile of pleasure, worth all the oranges in the world when she received her present. And might I tell you how she divided the orange into pieces, and gave one to each of the family, and how after it had all been eaten tears came to her bright eyes when she learned that Balser had not tasted the fruit. I might tell you much more that would be interesting, and show you how good and true and gentle were those honest, simple folk, but I must drop it all and begin my story. Balser told Tom about the traps, and a trapping expedition was quickly agreed upon between the boys. The next day, Tom went to visit Balser, and for 3 or 4 days the boys were busily engaged in making 2 sleds upon which to carry provisions for their campaign. The sleds, when finished, were about 2 feet broad and 6 feet long. They were made of elm, and were very strong, and were so light that when loaded the boys could easily draw them over the snow. By the time the sleds were finished, the snow was hard, and everything was ready for the moving of the expedition. First, the traps were packed. Then provisions, consisting of sweet potatoes, a great lump of maple sugar, a dozen loaves of white bread, 2 or 3 gourds full of butter, a side of bacon, a bag of meal, a large piece of bear meat for their dogs, and a number of other articles and simple utensils such as the boys would need in cooking were loaded upon the sleds. They took with them no meat other than the bacon and the bear meat for the dogs, for they knew they could make traps from the boughs of trees in which they could catch quail and pheasants, and were sure to be able, in an hour's hunting, to provide enough venison to supply their wants for a much longer time than they would remain in camp. There were also wild turkeys to be killed and fish to be caught through openings which the boys would make in the ice of the creek. Over the loaded sleds they spread woolly bearskins to be used for beds and covering during the cold nights, and they also took with them a number of tanned deerskins with which to carpet the floor of their castle and to close its doors and windows. Tom took with him his wonderful hatchet, an axe, and his father's rifle. Axe, hatchets, and knives had been sharpened, and bullets had been molded in such vast numbers that one would have thought the boys were going to war. Powder horns were filled, and a can of that precious article was placed carefully upon each of the sleds. Bright and early one morning, Balser, Tom, and Jim, and last but by no means least, Tige and Prince, crossed the Blue River and started in a northwestern direction toward a point on Brandywine, where a number of beaver dams were known to exist, 10 miles distant from the Brent cabin. Tom and Tige drew one of the sleds, and Balser and Prince drew the other. During the first part of the trip, Jim would now and then lend a helping hand, but toward the latter end of the journey he said he thought it would be better for him to ride upon one of the sleds to keep the load from falling off. Balser and Tom, however, did not agree with him, nor did the dog, so Jim walked behind and grumbled, and had his grumbling for his pains, as usually is the case with grumblers. 2 or 3 hours before sunset the boys reached Brandywine, a babbling little creek in springtime, winding its crooked, rippling way through the overhanging boughs of water elm, sycamore, and willows, but at the time of our hero's expedition frozen over with the mail of winter. It is in small creeks such as Brandywine that beavers love to make their dams. Our little caravan, upon reaching Brandywine, at once took to the ice and started upstream along its winding course. Jim had grown tired. "I don't believe you fellows know where you're going," said he. "I don't see any place to camp." "You'll see it pretty quickly," said Balser. And when they turned a bend in the creek, they beheld a huge sycamore springing from a little valley that led down to the water's edge. "There's our home," said Balser. The sycamore was hollow, and at its roots was an opening for a doorway. Upon beholding the tree, Jim gave a cry of delight and was for entering their new home at once, but Balser held him back and sent in the dogs as an exploring advance guard. Soon the dogs came out and informed the boys that everything within the tree was all right, and Balser and Tom and Jim stooped low and entered upon the possession of their castle on Brandywine. The first task was to sweep out the dust and dry leaves. This the boys did with bundles of twigs rudely fashioned into brooms. The dry leaves and small tufts of black hair gave evidence all too strongly that the castle, which the boys had captured, was the home of some barren bear who had incautiously left his stronghold unguarded. Jim spoke of this fact with unpleasant emphasis, and was ready to bet that the bear would come back when they were all asleep and would take possession of his castle and devour the intruders. "What will you bet?" said Tom. "I didn't say I would bet anything. I just said I'd bet, and you'll see I'm right," returned Jim.